Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. With the Minister of State and the PMO's comment on Article 370 creating disturbance and possibly anger in Kashmir, we interview the former Maharaja on what Article 370 actually amounts to and why it's critical for maintaining Kashmir's link with the rest of the country. That's a special interview with Dr. Karan Singh in part 2. But first, with leaders in America and China ringing the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister and raising expectations of a significant shift in the relationship, we examine India's ties with the two countries that are possibly the most important in the world, America and China. And now joining me to discuss India's relationship with Washington and Beijing is former Foreign Secretary Lalit Mansingh, former Secretary in the MEA KC Singh, the former editor of the Hindu Siddharth Vardarajan, and the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal Chaudhary. Mr. Lalit Mansingh, in your eyes, how significant is Chinese Premier Li Keqiangs' phone call yesterday to Mr. Modi? According to the Hindu correspondent in Beijing, the conversation lasted for 40 minutes.
Yes, not surprising, Karan. To me, it looks like a replay of the year 2000, when the leaders of the world made a procession to Delhi to shake hands with Mr. Vajpayee and sign strategic agreements. Then also we saw both the US and China wanting India's friendship. And so I think that's the role India has learned to play again.
But you know, you're a former foreign secretary. When two prime ministers talk for 40 minutes, would you say that that is surprisingly long, particularly because it's an introductory phone call and they're only really getting to know each other for the first time?
Yeah, but remember, Karan, 20 minutes are taken in translation. So 40 minutes sounds impressive, but it would be a normal conversation. Plus, don't forget, Mr. Modi has been to China several times, has had contacts with Chinese leaders. So there is that little extra that they needed to talk about.
Now, Mr. KC Singh, the Chinese Premier said that he wants to build a robust partnership with India, and he's decided to send his Foreign Minister Wang Yi on the 8th. Is a robust partnership possible and likely, or do you think that's just the sort of diplomatic rhetoric when two prime ministers are introducing themselves to each other?
I think this is normal opening rhetoric. Of course, the two nations have a good relationship, but it is a fact that this is a relationship which has both cooperation, competition and friction at a time that China, a rising China, is pushing all along its periphery. And India is also trying to engage other countries like Japan, Vietnam, etc., which are at the receiving end of Chinese negative attention. Critical moment because global hegemon. And President Obama's address at West Point indicates that US no longer has the desire to be the only global policeman. And you have a rising China. So a relationship with India will have to be a balance while we build up our capacities.
You know, that's very much the issue I want to go into in a moment's time. But before I come to that, let me explore a little with you, Siddharth Vardarajan, what Mr. Modi's attitude to China is likely to be. We know that he's visited the country 3 times, and the media claims that he has a certain particular fascination either for the country or possibly, in fact, even for the Chinese economic system. What's your belief about Mr. Modi's attitude to China? No, we don't seem to have Siddharth Vardarajan at that point. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, let me put that question to you. We've lost the link to Siddharth Vardarajan. Will you answer that question for me?
Yes, I think there are two things here. Modi has no delusions, I think, about the fact that China is a strategic competitor to India. And in fact, I gather in his first official meeting with Chinese officials in Beijing, one of the questions he asked them is, Pakistan is India's enemy number 1. You are Pakistan's friend number 1. What does that make you to India? On the other hand, he also has made it clear that he wants to do business. He doesn't have any problems with large-scale Chinese investment in India, which is something the Chinese have been desperately trying to push here. And he has been very impressed, as anybody would be, to go to China and see the kind of infrastructure, the manufacturing sector that they have developed, and the efficiency with which the Chinese government is able to push through economic decisions. And these are things, all these three elements are in Modi's mind when he speaks and talks about China. But I think fundamentally he believes, believes that if I develop a base of a Chinese relationship on the economic side, I can help stabilize some of that strategic competition between India and China.
When he raised that first issue you mentioned, that India regards Pakistan as enemy number one, but you regard Pakistan as your closest ally. What does this mean for India? What response do you believe he got from the Chinese? I take it must have been one that he was satisfied with, but what was that response?
From what I gather is the Chinese did not respond at all. They just merely said, thank you for your very frank statement, and moved on.
And did the question impress the Chinese just as much as the avoidance of the answer perhaps impressed Mr. Modi?
Yeah, I would say that the Chinese like frank conversation, and they like to meet a leader who puts things out on the table. George Bush disliked the Chinese intensely. He used to tell them quite openly, there is nothing between the US and China that between the two.
Oh, we seem to be losing that line to Pramit Pal Chaudhary as well. We seem to have terrible trouble with lines at this moment. Mr. Man Singh, let me put this to you. How do you believe the Chinese view Mr. Modi? We've heard excerpts of what they allegedly said to him and what he asked of them during his visits. It said that during his visit in 2011, he met members of the Chinese Politburo and they received him at the Great Hall of the People, which is where usually heads of government are received. Would that have been a signal honor to a visiting chief minister?
Yeah, that is true. I think the Chinese have a sense of comfort with Mr. Modi, and obviously they regard him as a man they can do business with. But the Chinese also know that there is a tougher side to Mr. Modi. Remember that when he went to Arunachal Pradesh, he made a speech in which he said, the Chinese mindset of expansion is not acceptable to us.
Oh, we've lost Mr. Man Singh as well. This is a direct result of the fact that we are doing this particular recording during the afternoon in Delhi, and there happens to be a terrible thunderstorm above us in the skies, and that is in fact affecting the OB connections. But we hope to be able, in fact, to go back to Pramit Pal Chaudhary. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, this particular set of hopes about an improved relationship with China happens at the same time as we have a border dispute that has been there for the last 65, 67 years. We have frequent border incursions which create either emotional excitement or even outright anger in the Indian media. And then, of course, there is that long, prolonged, lingering problem of visas for Indians from Arunachal Pradesh. How much of a dampener would all of that be on whatever hopes have been raised about a robust partnership, particularly with the forthcoming visit from the Chinese Foreign Minister as a special envoy to get to know the new government here? How much of a dampener would that be?
Well, I think the biggest problem, we can probably work ourselves around the visa. We can probably absorb some of the issues on the river waters. These are issues that have been there. They've been pending for a while. The Chinese policy has been consistent. What we need to be very wary about, though, is the border policy. The border incursions between China and India have gone up and down. But the Chinese have been unpredictable on this issue, and it sometimes can be quite baffling to the Indian side what exactly is happening. When Xi Jinping came to power and he met Manmohan Singh in Durban in South Africa, the first meeting they had at the BRICS summit, he said, let's forget about the problems we've had in the past 3 or 4 years about the border, the Kashmir visas, let's start Panchsheel, all of that all over again. And then in fact, the Li Keqiangs was supposed to come to visit. He's announced the Chinese premier would also visit India, the first country he was going to come to as premier. And just 6 weeks before he was to come, we had the Debsang border incursion, which was a clear violation of the border understandings we had between India and China. And the Indian side rightly was baffled. What was going on here? Why were we getting these cross signals from China? And it's still not clear why that happened. It may have been an internal battle within China. It may have been something completely different. But this unpredictability is something that really always lies behind the thinking of at the senior level in India when you're dealing with China. Okay. I think Modi's sense is the Chinese are offering billions of dollars worth of investment into India. Let's start letting that in, and hopefully this will stabilize a relationship and make China's leadership be willing to try and bring some predictability on the security side of the relationship.
Now we have Lalit Mansingh, the former Foreign Secretary, back with us. Mr. Mansingh, while you were away, we were talking about the political unpredictability of the relationship with China. That is the particular phrase used by Pramit Pal Chaudhary. And he referred to how, oh, we seem to have lost Mr. Mansingh yet again as that critical point. I'll come back to you, Pramit. You know, one of the things that Mr. Modi certainly is going to rely upon in a big way, because it's so central to his economic push that he needs to give to this particular economy at the moment, is a boost in trade relations. But already the balance of trade with China is hugely adversely against India. So how much room is there for Mr. Modi to be able to boost trade and also improve the trade balance at the same time? Because boosting trade and making that balance worse would be a bit counterproductive.
Well, first, the single largest export India had to China was iron ore. And the environmental and political problems we had, the Bellary mines and the ban on iron ore exports from India, effectively ensured that no matter what we did, we would have an enormous trade deficit with China. The second thing we have to keep in mind, which is why Modi is looking at investment, is that if China exports large numbers, as it does to everywhere in the world, of light manufactured products to India. So if we allow the Chinese to set up factories in India, build infrastructure that allows them to export from India, we will then effectively mean that the jobs in China are now transferred to India, and the trade deficit is therefore reduced. We also need, on the third element, is to try to get the Chinese to come to an understanding is that if we allow this on our side, we allow you to invest in our country, you have to open up to Indian services, which is where we are competitive, and which China at present puts up a huge large number of trade barriers to. And I think that's the equation that he's going to try to work around, try to put together. And if he can put that together, that would be quite transformational. Let's understand what the Chinese have offered. The Chinese have said, we are prepared to put in $300 billion into India to build up your infrastructure, because the Chinese have huge surpluses of capital they really don't know what to do with. And that would be transformational. That would be probably more, frankly, than the Indian economy could absorb in the next 10 years. But as I said, these are the kind of figures you're looking at the Chinese offering us.
I have Siddharth Varadarajan, the former editor of The Hindu, with us, but only by telephone. That's a secure line at this moment when the weather in Delhi is so appalling and the OBs are not functioning. Siddharth Varadarajan, while you were away, we were talking about the way Mr. Modi might look to boost the trade relationship with China without actually making the already adverse trade balance between the two countries even worse. And we've heard Pramit Pal Chaudhary talking about how Mr. Modi might want to insist that China opens its doors to services. And we don't right know what the Chinese response will be, but the Chinese, their part, are very keen that electronic companies like Huawei should be given a bigger role in India's electronics industries and in its telecommunication industry. India has a certain security concern about that. How serious will Mr. Modi take that sort of security concern when on the opposite side are very large, substantial Chinese FDI money waiting to come in? Would he be like the UPA, very concerned and give greater priority to security over FDI, or might he change the balance somewhat?
What we know now, based on Snowden's revelations about the NSA's own activities and American concerns about China, and the fact that the Americans have even managed to piggyback onto Huawei servers and equipment and switching equipment, I think it would be absolutely suicidal for India to relax its approach to these kinds of high-tech investments on the Chinese side. So I think that, Mr. Modi will have to look for advances in other areas. I think India has always been willing to accept Chinese investments in light manufacturing, as Pramit Pal was suggesting. And India has also been pressing the Chinese on non-tariff barriers, as well as access to the Chinese market for Indian pharma companies and service companies. I think everything boils down to the Chinese attitude. I think the Chinese ought to recognize that for a variety of reasons, the kind of US-India relationship that the US at one point tried to build, and which the Indians were quite receptive to, India may be more willing to take an independent position or to not get caught up in sharpening contradictions between Washington and the US and Beijing. So perhaps that opens the door for the Chinese to now be more reasonable in using economic interaction with India as a lever to ensure that India remains equidistant between the United States and China. I think that may provide a possibility for Modi to make headway where Manmohan Singh failed to.
You know, we've got Mr. Lalit Mansingh, the former Foreign Secretary, back with us, and let's hope the weather holds this time for a little longer than it did last time. Mr. Mansingh, this is a good point at which to change our conversation from India-China to India-the United States. In the last few days, President Obama has phoned Mr. Modi, John Kerry has phoned Sushma Swaraj. As someone who's been a former Foreign Secretary, are the Americans making, and forgive me, you've also been a former ambassador to Washington, are the Americans making a special effort because they believe they slighted Mr. Modi by refusing him a visa, and secondly, because they were slow to reach out to him, unlike the Europeans? Do you sense that that's one reason why these phone calls are coming so thick and furiously?
Karan, I think the visa issue is not the most important one. The fact is that Indo-US relations have reached the worst point in 10 years because of a variety of reasons.
Let me bring you in there, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and before I come to the points that were actually being made by Mr. Mansingh, which I want to explore in a big way, let me ask you a quick question about Mr. Modi. You heard Mr. Mansingh say that the personal relationship, the refusal of a visa was not in fact the biggest problem. But to what extent does it rankle with Mr. Modi? For instance, it was a very personal attack, if I can use that phrase in quotations, that kept him out of the United States, that refused him a visa and in fact scrapped the earlier visa he had. Do you think it still rankles with him? Because if it does, it would be understandable. Or do you think now that he's Prime Minister, he's decided to be statesmanlike and put it behind him? Do we have any way of working out the answer to that?
Well, it's hard to say. His public statements have been very clear that when I'm a Prime Minister, relations between countries will not be driven by these minor individual issues. But on the other hand, my understanding when I've talked to people close to Modi is that definitely on the economic relationship, the defense relationship, the intelligence relationship, these are simply too important for India and the United States to go anywhere, and these will be restored to as much as they can be done. The real question is the personal chemistry between Modi and Obama, I suspect, will never be quite as good as it was, for example, between Bush and Manmohan Singh, or even for that matter between Obama and Manmohan Singh. But keep in mind one other factor that Modi will be looking at. Obama is almost a lame duck. If he loses the Senate, he's been struggling already. He now has worse poll ratings than Bush had at the worst point in his presidency. And if he loses the Senate in November, which seems likely at present, if you go by the present polls, he will effectively have lost control of the US Congress to a very hostile Republican Party. At that point, his presidency is effectively over. He will have 2 years in which he will essentially just float around waiting for the US presidential election campaign.
Okay.
So the question for Modi is, do I really want to invest in a person like this?
Absolutely. That's a big question. Let me put that to K.C. Singh, the former Secretary of the MA, who's with us, but once again by phone, not by OB, because of that terrible weather condition in Delhi. Whilst he was with us and before the OB, in his case, collapsed, the former Foreign Secretary and former Ambassador to Washington, Lalit Mansingh, was saying that India at the moment is going through its worst relationship with the United States over the last 10 years. I want to ask you, Mr. K.C. Singh, as a foreign policy analyst, what do you believe are the key irritants in the Delhi-Washington relationship beyond America's disappointment with India's nuclear liability law, which has clearly prevented the United States from harvesting any benefit from the Indo-US nuclear deal? What would you say are the other key irritants?
Relations, they feel that India hasn't moved fast enough, opened quickly enough, and let their corporate sector come in. And then this also fed back into the negotiations where we took a particular stand on Narega and the food bill. And there, I think there's a lot of bad blood between US trade representative and India's commerce minister, which fed back into the US system. They thought that we were very negative, we're not letting the discussions move forward. And secondly, when it is not guided from the top and this relationship slows down, it breaks up it's taken over by different components on both sides, and they get into a boxing match with each other, and essentially that is what has been happening. So it needs really quick redirection from the top, We need a US ambassador in Delhi who has access to the White House, not just to the State Department. And we need to really get to the political dimensions of this relationship very quickly.
Now, Siddharth Badarajan, we're talking about a relationship with Lalit Mansingh, the former Foreign Secretary and former Ambassador to America, described as the lowest it's been in the last 10 years. But at the same time, there is a situation in Afghanistan that is of deep concern to India. America has announced that it will reduce its troop levels in Afghanistan to 9,800 by January, to half of that by 2016, and down to zero practically by 2017, when they'll really just be embassy and embassy security level. How much of a concern is that to India, which would require us to have close discussions with the United States on how the Afghan situation develops, and to develop an understanding with the Obama government, regardless of Obama's political fortunes as outlined by Pramit Pal Chaudhary in America itself?
Has built its policy around the assumption that the US will not be there indefinitely. I mean, Obama announced a deadline, and by all accounts, they're sticking to that process. So India has already begun to explore other sorts of options. You would have seen a news item a few weeks ago of India helping to finance Afghan purchases of military hardware by soft loans to the Russians. So, there is a sense in which India is already battening down the hatches and preparing for the worst. The key issue really is how capable will the Afghan National Security Forces be in dealing with the kind of threats that the Taliban and the Haqqani, with their Pakistani backers, are going to pose for the Afghan government. And I think that beyond the point, the US also, even though Obama was pretty clear in West Point that the US can, the perfect Afghanistan is not something that the US can accomplish, but the US also cannot afford to walk away. So I think that this is an area where India would have to remain engaged. It's one thing for Obama to be crippled domestically, but I think the United States' global footprint will continue to be so important both to the east and the west of India that I think the United States will be a very, very important relationship for the Modi administration to be focused on.
Very quickly, let me go back to Pramit Pal Chaudhary before I go to Lalit Mansingh, who I believe we could have on the phone at least for a last word before we end. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, America clearly has concerns about China. We have a relationship with China that we hope will blossom and bloom, but equally we have our concerns about China as well. Can India benefit from America's concerns about China by clever diplomacy? Pramit Pal Chaudhary? Oh, it's your turn to be lost to us. One by one, each and every one of my four guests have suffered today. This is really and truly bad weather hitting us, as it's probably never hit any program that I've ever been on before. Let me then give that last word to you, Lalit Mansingh. You're both a former ambassador to Washington and a former foreign secretary, and clearly one of the country's best foreign policy strategists. Given America's concerns about China, can India, through clever diplomacy, benefit from those concerns and help ease its way out of what you described earlier as the worst relationship in 10 years with Washington?
I'm an optimist. I think the relations are going to improve. Firstly, the economy is going to improve in India. That's a plus point to the United States. The Obama's reset with Asia is coinciding with our Look East policy. We are both developing closer relations with Japan. So these are all signals that we will have much more in common than will be our differences. But mind you, I want to stress one point. The key to better relations with the US doesn't lie in the MEA, it lies in the hands of the new finance minister, because that's where the bilateral problems are. The tax issue, the IPR issues with American pharmaceuticals, the local content issue with various industries, defense industries, all these are tricky policies that require quick decisions, and I think Mr. Modi will be able to handle them very soon.
And I'm sure that Arun Jaitley as finance minister is also determined to ensure that they're handled quickly and promptly and to the best that India can offer America, because clearly they want those irritants out of the way, because they're also fundamental to the economic recovery this government has promised the country. We're going to end this particular part of the program there.